We have a lot of things, so I suggest to start. And I would like to invite Nicole to open this session. Nicole Bibau, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I think here's nearly no one who does not know me, so I will not introduce myself. And this white paper we are presenting here is a product of 9 years' work of EU-PolarNet. So EU-PolarNet, as most of you might know, will end this year, and we worked for 9 years on improving research cooperation, infrastructure usage, all on a European level. And we started already in EU-PolarNet 1 to work on observations. In EU-PolarNet 1, it was more the operational side of observations. So we mapped what is there from a European perspective and how we can close gaps which are not covered by observations and how we can improve also the technology. In EU-PolarNet 2, we work much more strategic. So it's not only describing gaps and techniques, but we work more on how to implement such a system. And this is where the white paper is all about, and this is what is presented today. And I'm really curious listening to all the talks. And that's all I want to say, because we have not a lot of time today. Thanks, Gael.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you very much for your introduction. And so let's start then. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session today. I see a lot of people who don't know me, so I will introduce myself. My name is Gael Leimer. I work for the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences in Brussels, and I'm the honored lead author of this EU-PolarNet white paper with recommendations for strengthening international polar observation that this session will introduce today. And before to jump into the white paper, I would like to set up the context because it is a white paper on polar observation delivered in a period of climate emergency. I believe you all know the concept of show your stripes. If you don't, I invite you to check up the website by Professor Ed Hawkins. That's my stripe here, this one. And I consider myself as one of the lucky ones because when I was a schoolboy, I still enjoyed a few years before the temperature started to rise significantly. Whereas now, the schoolboys and schoolgirls of 10 years old or younger, they do worry about climate change. They know about biodiversity loss, and they know that this might be a real threat for their future. And it is a period of climate emergency indeed. I believe you also read the recent publication on 2023 being the hottest year ever recorded. The Arctic warms up 4 times faster than the rest of the world. Changes in Antarctica are underestimated, and the Arctic would go ice-free in less than a decade. To give you a concrete timing, that's 3 years after the end of the 2021-27 multi-annual financial framework, the long-term EU funding system. So it's not in a decade, it's not in 6 years, it's even not tomorrow, it is in a few minutes. So we have to do things, and I'm even not going into the details of all the threats that climate change may pose for the future of the next generations. And so if we don't want to leave them with only crisis and problems to deal with, we need to equip them with the tools and the system that will allow them to continue to observe and understand the Earth system to adapt. And there are initiatives that exist to observe polar regions. In this white paper that I'm introducing today, we identified more than 100 initiatives, data committees, national research and funding agencies, organization of Arctic indigenous people. We provide the contacts and the details in the white papers. For some of them, we even provide the purpose. It's a very rich paper. But we also identified that there are prospects for improvement in observing polar regions, because polar observations are currently sparse, with observing networks fragmented and lacking large-scale coordination. So it's like the polar observation landscape is broken up with gaps and potential duplications and overlaps. like for a fragmented system of a laptop or computer, and we advocate in this white paper for a defragmentation of the polar observing landscape. Because there are prospects for improvement in many aspects of polar observation, prospect for improvements, of course, in climate system and Earth system understanding, prospect for improvement in prioritization in observation and research, prospect for improvement in inclusivity, in international collaboration, prospects for improvement in data harmonization and standardization. And a long-term sustainable observing system requires long-term sustainable funding, of course. So that will cost some money, but the good news is that the economic returns that are projected from such an investment are supposed to overcome by far the initial investment. I invite you to check the literature on that. So these are the reasons why we come with this EU-PolarNet white paper with recommendations to accelerate the development of a fully integrated polar observing system, that's the title, for strengthening collaboration among international scientific stakeholders, rights holders, and funding communities to advance polar observation and support optimally advised decision-making processes. We formulated the recommendations via a collective process. We organized consultations, workshop, meetings with stakeholders and experts in science, data, funding, international collaboration, and other aspects. There is a writing team, of course, behind this white paper that gathered regularly to advance it. I thank them all very much for all their work. And we requested reviewers from different backgrounds to try to make it as rich as possible. We relied on the literature and on the previous work to build up from them, and we participated to targeted events and symposium to collect as many information as possible that we then adapted into policy level actionable recommendations. The white paper is soon to be available. If I understood, it will be delivered this week. And it's available for everyone involved in polar observation development, European, non-European, national and international decision makers, funding agencies, academias, NGOs, and everyone of goodwill. We provide more than 80 actionable policy level recommendations within 7 pillars: users, stakeholders, and right holders, data, observing infrastructures, funding and societal benefits, governance, international collaboration in research, and societal relevance. Within each pillar, we identified and designed subcategories, for example, here for data and sharing the data. And then within each subcategory, we provide very concrete recommendations, such as register polar data and observing assets in relevant catalogs, relying on existing initiatives, such as the Polar Data Ecosystem Mapping and the Registry of Polar Observing Networks. We did that within the 7 pillars. Don't worry, I won't go through the details of the 80 recommendations. I invite you to read the white paper for that. We also provide very specific recommendations to the European Commission and EU decision makers. I invite you to follow the talk by Hannele Savela on this topic. And now the paper will be available, so I invite you to make it yours, to open it, read it, close it, open it again, read it again, come back to us, and use the recommendations that are inside. They are actionable, concrete recommendations. They are there to strengthen polar observation, leveraging natural shared interests between the polar regions. The idea is to develop a coordinated system for continuous, inclusive, and sustainable transnational polar observation and research of high societal relevance to support well-informed decision-making processes. That will require some commitment from everyone, from the politics, from the funding agencies, the scientists, and even the NGOs, to reach actually what should be now the next step. That's the action, the activation of these recommendations. So we will work on that in the next months, starting today, and I invite you all to join the network. Thank you very much. I call now the next speaker. I think it's Jan. You prefer to speak there or there?
Yeah, and thank you also for inviting Mikael to this. Many of you know the work of the roads process, but I believe that it was relevant to put it into some kind of perspective when we talk about the white paper, because these are the pillars that have been defined through our work. But the question will always be how to prioritize among these things when we talk about actual observations. What will be the most important thing to observe and apply for funding, develop infrastructures, etc., etc. I don't have to explain to you, you've done it very well, about the changes in the Arctic and that there is fragmentation in the work. Within the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks, we have a role of being a place for development of partnerships and of engagement, and to have a better way of planning what should be prioritized. We have developed the roads process to address this. SEAN has always had a road map task of saying where to go, where, but we stepped a bit back and said, why don't we start discussing who, for whom do we do this? And for many of the questions, the observables that we're discussing, they are of interest at several levels. They could be very local. If you talk about wildfire, it's about safety, about being able to evacuate, destruction of your home, etc. When we talk about the regional, the Arctic level, the interest in wildfire could be on the black carbon that is emitted from from wildfires, but also at the global level, black carbon, other short-lived climate forces, wildfires has importance for anything that is done to improve climate. So in this case, for wildfire, there are actors at very different levels, and the idea was to start by understanding who would be interested in observations. And when you see you could say the path from observations and all the way to products and discussions of societal benefits of observations, we have, or a tool has been developed where we are able to identify for each of these observations done how they can address specific societal benefits. And by doing these mapping, doing these tools, you're able to demonstrate the value of observation. That is, of course, something that you want to do when you talk to funders. We believe that such an analysis, and that's what we're doing within the roads process, is what is needed to document the value of observing in the polar regions. And you referred to the Dubricic work there, and that is exactly the deliberations that are behind this idea of investing in observing, but get a return. And again, as one of the tools that we are doing in this planning and prioritization process, we seek to understand needs both at the very local level, demonstrated by Salman here, by understanding specific needs, but also having in mind all the work that is already done on the global level to define the global essential variables. But we have developed this idea of shared Arctic variables that seek to span across all of these different levels, but always with the idea to have societal relevant, societal benefits, that understanding of that as part of the process. So we believe that this concept is essential. In order to develop these ideas, we have developed this advisory process, and we have a panel that is working on advising expert panels that have been established. And expert panels could either address a regional subject. In our case, we have work that is related to Svalbard and to Finland, certain areas in Finland. You can also work from a topical perspective. We have a wildfire expert panel, we have a permafrost expert panel, but you could also work from an issue-driven perspective. In case of wildfire, this is obviously an issue that expert panel is working with. And we're asking each of our expert panels to go through this phased approach, where they, at each step, are provided some advice on how they progress in terms of that overall goal of establishing a planning process and making sure that everybody knows who should do what, and also how this is funded by the end. And as part of this, as I said, we do this assessment of the societal relevance of the observations that is translated into specific requirements in terms of observations and data management. And finally, for the who is supposed to fund this, who is actually supposed to do it, we also request our expert panels to develop an actual implementation strategy for their work. It's important for us. We have formulated guiding principles, and one of the most important one is that indigenous engagement is funded, and we are also putting emphasis on integrating with existing networks. We're not interested in doing things that are done already, overlapping with existing initiatives. So with these, I just would like to invite you to the Arctic Observing Summit starting on Wednesday, where we will, in several working groups and sessions, discuss these principles. There is a working group of local to global observing, one on data sharing, one on the roads process as such, and then also a working group on this work on making sure that that what you do in terms of observing has societal relevance. This is a work initiated by a group of people, and there is a specific journal article that you can read that are more details about this. But again, returning to the context here for the prioritization of the many things that we want to do, this is a direction to look at when it comes to making sure that you actually define the observations that has societal benefit and relevance. Thank you.
René Savella, I invite you to take the floor.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you, and I will tell you a little bit more about these EU-specific recommendations that we are providing in the white paper. But first, I could tell a couple words about myself. My name is Hannele Savella. I work at the University of Oulu, and I'm leading transnational access activity in Interact Network and PolarNet network. And in that role, I'm working with the research infrastructures and observations and the monitoring that is done at these research infrastructures. And there I have kind of experienced the importance to integrate and harmonize the observations to really effectively produce information that provides societal benefits. And kind of the background and outline of the white paper was to focus and bring up these recommendations directed towards the EU and European Commission, because as you see, the ambition of the whole EU-PolarNet 2 project is to establish a sustainable and inclusive platform to co-develop and advance European polar research actions and to give evidence-based advice to policymaking processes on polar issues. And then the specific objectives that we had in task 6.1, who was working on this white paper that we are talking about now or launching now, is to optimize polar observing capacities with a unified European voice and to facilitate better coordination and alignment of the European polar observing community and observing capacities through improved information sharing and communication at an international level. So this kind of outlines the importance of this white paper and why we specifically wanted to focus to provide recommendations to the EU. And as Gael already showed to you, this work resulted to over 80 recommendations structured around these 7 pillars. And these EU-specific recommendations were kind of teased out from this 80 plus recommendations. And in addition, there's also some that are not directly included here, but they were like placed directly under these EU-specific recommendations. And here you can see the presentation of these EU-specific recommendations. And there are altogether 9 actionable policy level recommendations, and these are structured around 3 different themes. Enhancing societal relevance of polar science, advancing science diplomacy, and then advancing international collaboration in the field of polar observations. So first to the theme 1, enhancing societal relevance of polar science. And there are 3 actionable recommendations. The first one is to dedicated funding calls for both polar regions. The second is to raise public awareness regarding climate change and enhance creditability of scientific observations in the general public and in the policy making. And the third would be to expand the dialogue with indigenous peoples and local communities to shape inclusive EU policies. Then the second theme was to advance science diplomacy efforts, and that is of course really important in the current geopolitical situation, and also that is affecting strongly the research. So the first recommendation under this theme would be to establish a sustainable EU presence at both poles, for example, utilizing these EU science diplomacy working groups. The second would be to enhance collaboration with allied countries and gateway states. Here we have a reference to the recent paper by Dodds and Raspotnik that was published last year. And then the third would be to maintain and enhance diplomatic relationships with major polar actors to advance environmental protection initiatives and so on. And then the third area would be to facilitate international collaboration in the field of observations, leading to more integrated and harmonizing observing efforts. And the first in this category would be to establish and continue enhance agreements for transnational access and unified polar investment program. So this funding aspect is really important to create such funding instruments that would enable these integrated observing efforts. Then we recommend the EU take a leadership role in harmonization and standardization of polar data to facilitate sharing of data and information. And then thirdly, to harmonize positions of EU member states, polar institutions for observation and evidence-based decisions. Then this last slide is about the key messages and actions that could be the next steps in this process. The first one would be that the implementation of these recommendations should begin immediately and proceed step by step, and adjusting the level and areas of collaboration and integration as going further, and to maybe start from those areas where there is a natural shared interest between Antarctic and the Arctic. Secondly, that the key areas of development in this integration process should include the recognition of user, stakeholder, and rights holder needs, the standardization of data and data systems, international sharing of research infrastructures, and development of joint funding mechanisms in polar observing. Thirdly, the EU is envisioned to fund the process of enhancing polar collaboration in the immediate future, while the sustained funding in long term is envisioned to be sought from countries with long-term interest in polar research. So starting with this EU support and then hopefully proceeding to this national funding. And recommendations provide a way forward to accelerate international collaboration and efforts in observation, importantly to meet the societal needs. The fifth point take-home message here is that the EU could help to unite nations in polar research and observing, and in doing so become a major contributor to the collective response posed by the climate change. And the final one would be that the decision makers and the EU can support the integration of existing research infrastructures and harmonization of observing efforts to facilitate transfer of knowledge between the Arctic and the Antarctic and contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of the polar environmental changes and their impacts on this whole planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annele. Is there, the time I changed the presentation, is there maybe a question, a couple of questions from someone? We can pick up maybe one question or two now if you have some. Otherwise, we will have time at the end of the session as well. I see no hand rising. I don't know if there's anyone following online and there would be questions in the chat or... Okay. And does that person have a question? Okay. And I'm not sure who is the next speaker, to be fair, but I would like to invite, is it John or Annette? That's one of you. So Annette. So thank you, Annette Schipstra. I give you the floor. Mike, and that's to go forward.
Thank you. There are some faces in the room that I don't know. So my name is Annette Scheepstra. I'm from the Netherlands. I work at the Arctic Center, University of Groningen. But you see here the logo of NWO, and that's because NWO, or the Netherlands Polar Program, is the official partner in EU-PolarNet. So I work for them in EU-PolarNet. And as you have seen so far in the previous presentations, and you can also read it in this white paper, there's a lot of attention for rights and stakeholders. And in EU-PolarNet, my role at the moment is to be a stakeholder guardian, so you can imagine that I'm very happy with that. So this is some of the text from the white paper and the aim, and I made in bold some things that I'm happy with, like there is really an urge to work with indigenous peoples, but also with other stakeholders, civil societies. And the whole white paper is really focused to serve also societal needs. And as Nicole also mentioned, this white paper is the result of a long process within EU-PolarNet 1 and EU-PolarNet 2. And a lot of the work that is also written in this white paper on stakeholder engagement and on rights holders and inclusion of indigenous peoples is based on all the experience we have had in this last 9 years. But I think in general, if you look, let's say 10 years back, we are in the process of ICARP. And if you look at ICARP 3 and what is going on now in ICARP 4, there is a lot more attention to how to include stakeholders, how to include rights holders. And this fits in the process we have been going through the last couple of years. So this is one of the recommendations, how you can find it in the white paper. And this is the first pillar. And I'm happy that the first pillar is also the user needs, stakeholder engagement and rights holders, because if you have an observing system, this is where it starts, into my opinion, with the user needs. And also, Gail started his presentation. There is really an urgent need. If you saw the pictures, and we see them over and over and over again, we have this enormous crisis which we need to handle. Luckily, there has been increased also in communication with stake and rights holders. The problem is that there is an urgent need and we really need to act fast. But if you look at how to engage with stake and rights holders, the processes take time. So there is a little bit of a conflict in that. So we need to do both, and it is important to start quickly. And we are working on gaining trust with rights holders, and we are working on including stakeholders, and there is a lot of information that we can use. But we need to keep in mind that there is this risk of conflict in how time is scheduled. Another thing that is a risk that is often mentioned is the stake and rights holders fatigue. And you already said in the first slide, there were hundreds more observations. we can't reach to all the stakeholders for all this. So there we also need to work on how to do that to avoid stake and rights holder fatigue. So there are risks, but the risk of not including them is even bigger. Because then you have a mismatch in what you want and what you need. So there is a need for reduction of efforts. So there's a lot of work for us to do how to really do that. As said, we have worked on these topics a lot in EU-PolarNet, and these are examples of 2 documents that played an important role in the writing process of this white paper. And one of them is the white paper on the status of stakeholder engagement that we developed in EU-PolarNet 1. Kirsi Lattila sitting there, she was the lead author of that. And it's based on all the things we did in EU-PolarNet 1, but also learned in EU-PolarNet 1. For us, it was also a learning endeavor, how to do this best. And we are still learning every day. And here we have concrete recommendations how you can engage with stakeholders. It is to be stressed, there's not one size fits all. It is always depending on the situations, on the kind of stake and rights holders. But this is a document that is, I think, very usable for a lot of researchers. And the other one was funded by EU-PolarNet in the so-called service contract. It is built on many workshops, many meetings from a so-called co-create collaborative. You can read the name, the Roadmap to Decolonial Arctic Research. And also in that roadmap that was written for the European Commission, there's a lot of information that can be used. And we just have rewritten this roadmap to also give specific recommendations for the ICAP process. But also we see that indigenous organizations are more focused how they want to work with researchers. So they, for instance, here the Sami Council has developed its own guidelines. So if you are a researcher and you want to work with us, this is how you do it. So you see that there is a more professional, I would always say, but more focus from the indigenous groups themselves. So this is how we want to cooperate with you. So I think that is also helping the process and helping this mismatch in speed, maybe. We are also working on a stakeholder tool, stakeholder and rights holders tool. This is sort of how it will look like. We're still in the middle of the process. I'm not going into details because tomorrow Kirsi is giving a presentation on that, and she will go into details in this session you can see here. It's not a tool that you say, oh, I work with stakeholders, tick off these boxes, and that's how we do it. But we will provide an enormous amount of documents and informations you can all use, or you can use a filter panel. Click on, it's just a very first draft, so there will be other filters and it will look differently, but we are working hard on this. Then I skip this and then I will end with promoting this, the Catalyst platform, not only because it will give a lot of possibilities to work with each other, get information, get news, but also this tool that I just showed will be based in this Catalyst platform. So it will be a good instrument to work together also in the future after EU-PolarNet ends. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Gail. So thank you. So my name is Jon Børre Ørbekk. I come from the Research Council in Norway, and I've also been part of Work Package 4, leading Work Package 4 in EU-PolarNet. And I will talk, the reason why I use this first slide with the logo RCN will be clear later, because later. So I will talk about how international collaboration and funding, how we can fund polar observations. What we started in the EU-PolarNet Work Package 4 was to produce these two catalogs and directory here, a catalog of the research performing organizations, those that are actually carrying out and delivering logistics and carrying out research in polar areas. And we did this analysis, the mapping of how polar research funding is organized in Europe. And this directory, just an example, it pointed out, there are ministries, agencies, science funds, and national foundations, private foundations, academies funding, and they are governed by, in many cases, interministerial bodies, national high-level committees, and science agencies, and things like that. But I will not talk so much about that. But also some examples, funding of polar research can be done in many different ways under Belmont Forum, joint Nordic initiatives, bilateral agreements, lead agency processes, and joint programming initiatives, and vice versa, a lot of things. But, and the reason why I was invited to this panel, this session, I think, was the belief that we did really also address polar observations in this, but we did not, for your information. We did not address the funding of research infrastructure and observations in that deliverable. So my take on this contribution to this session is to dawdle a little around how we fund observations in Norway and in Europe. So there, for the past years, it has been a lot of attention on funding research infrastructure and observations. The main thing is the ESFRI, what we call the ESFRI process, the European Strategy Forum on Research Infrastructure, which is a high-level committee set up in Europe that are elaborating and forming, publishing these roadmaps, the road mapping process on research infrastructure. And the European Commission is funding preparatory phase of such roadmap processes. The transnational access also provides access to many of those research infrastructures. And it has been followed up by road mapping processes also in European countries, like in Norway, we have the roadmap for research infrastructure. We have the similar in many other countries. And there are also, of course, the environmental agencies that are providing funding for observations. In Norway and Sweden it's called Naturvårdsverket. Here in Norway, or there in Norway, it's called Environmental Agency. The roadmap in Norway, for example, we do have a huge call for research infrastructure every second year. And it funds, in many cases, contribution to observing systems. And it is not small-scale observations, it's large-scale infrastructure or observations of what we call national character. That means it's not a small user group, it's a wide and broad user group of those observations. And it's very important to know that in order to fund observations, it's not only the research agencies that fund, in many cases, it's funded by the monitoring agencies, right? What we call environmental agencies, at least in Scandinavia. Here are examples of observing systems that are funded, where we contribute funding in Norway. So we do fund, for example, Norwegian contribution to the EMSO, to the ICOS, to the Euro Argo part, gliders, and many other things. I will just for information. It's a similar thing, of course, in other countries. And most of these are distributed observing systems. So here is just a slide describing a little bit how we see the sharing of roles in funding observations. So you have the research funding organizations. Their role is to fund the research and also the research infrastructure, or you could say observing infrastructure. And we develop the research agenda. And the environmental agencies are funding the monitoring, the data collection and synthesis work. The research performing organizations are different types. You have the universities, you have the governmental research institutes that can be instructed by the government to do specific tasks. And you have the competitive private or environmental institutes. In Norway, that part is very well developed. It's a number of environmental research institutes. So these Just in many cases, the universities are able to commit to follow up long time serious and monitoring activities, but based on their research interest. In the governmental organizations, of course, do have long-term committed observations in their what do you call it, the plan, and in their task for their owners, the ministries. But the competitive private environment institutes, they can do management-related observations. They can also use research infrastructure, but they're not in that respect able to own or operate observation systems. Here is now I'll talk about some models for funding. So, for example, the ESFRI model, what I call the ESFRI model, is a very successful model to fund and operate for a long-term and observing system. So many of those ESFRI projects are distributed observing systems. Here are, I already mentioned ICOS, EMSO, Argo. You have ACTRIS in the atmosphere, and you have EPOS, European Plate Observing System. There are many more. And they are organized and institutionalized as an organization with its own legal entity. And it's not, the members are countries. It's country membership, which means that if you should decide to be a member or not a member, it's a decision by the government. And the funding is what we define normally as a long-term committed funding is 5 years, even for those country membership organizations. But it's a very strong case because it's not easy to skip out of it. And it's a pan-European endeavor. And it's supported by the national road mapping processes. And I would say that, well, you could think about an integrated polar observing system or an Arctic observing system. It could be an ESFRI project. But the problem is that the Arctic observing system is extremely multidisciplinary. It consists of extremely many systems, you know, and it is not really easy to see a very harmonized, integrated Arctic observing system organized as a company like that. But it's not, one should think that thought, I think. The other thing is, of course, the campaign model. Then you could easily look, especially at the governmental institutes, easily, you know, funding campaigns. They own their own ships and things like that. So many examples of campaign-based observations. And I think, obviously, thinking about the ICAR process and the process towards International Polar Year, and we discussed it yesterday. Obviously, we would need to work for or influence the EEC that there will be some calls for large-scale initiatives that are addressing the polar year, which is, of course, about coordinated observations. But a very important part of that is, of course, the commitment by the national, especially governmental institutes, those that are actually having the capacities in terms of observing infrastructure. The other one, of course, for an agency, when we fund the normal research projects that are collecting data, of course, we need to be very clear about our requirements for data management. And all those observations need to contribute to a larger system. And that's a lot of things happens in Europe, also on the EU level, about what kind of requirements, what do we mean by fair data and things like that. But that's a thing all agencies funding polar research need to think about in order to know that the projects they fund are actually contributing to something else. I know that it was mentioned in the white paper. Another thing is that the funders need to address how we are contributing to harmonized variables and also harmonizing variable geometry observations. I know that, of course, all the work being done under Sion Rhodes process with the shared Arctic variables, or you could also say essential Arctic variables, is, of course, when funders are funding projects, one should be clear what kind of observations and how are they done, how are they harmonized to other measurements. In Norway, we also we support super sites. Other countries will also do that. It's very, very, very important to do that, because at the super sites you can more easily do harmonization. And the polar cluster process do have shared or joint activities concerning data portals and harmonization. The European Commission has provided a lot of money to harmonize and coordinate the environment or the distributed environmental observation infrastructures under the ENRI-FAIR community. And EU just last year had a very, very interesting call called in 2023 called Closing the Research Gaps on Essential Ocean Variables in Support of Global Assessments. And that is actually a very important call, because it addresses observations on a higher TRL level, which means in connection with Earth observations, for example. It is about to further develop the observations into more operationability. And those ocean variables were related to physical, biogeochemical, and ecosystem variables. I think 2 or 3 projects were funded there. So one could look for a similar call addressing the Arctic essential variables. And actually that is already on the table from ESA. So here you have there is actually this tender call now for fixed Arctic studies. It's a deadline 5th of May, and it's addressing these 3 areas. So for the Arctic, it says in the call Arctic sea ice variability, freshwater influence, and biogeochemical carbon cycle and things like that. So that's actually also a way of operationalize observations, in situ observation, together with the Earth observing capabilities. And it's a tender, so and it's supported to establish something that can be on a more longer term basis. So by that, I think almost the last slide is what we worked hard to establish was a cooperation among research funders in Europe. We worked to establish what we call a program level cooperation among polar research funders in Europe, connected to the Horizon Europe framework program. And that, I think, for the next framework for FP10, which will overlap with the International Polar Year, we should think about such a system, because a program level cooperation would help establish a forum among funders that can more easily set up a significant European contribution to the next International Polar Year. So that's something we will, of course, follow in the next years. So my conclusion, I'm not sure how to conclude, but obviously, looking at polar observations from a funder's perspective, it is a variable geometry system. There are national funding to many different things. There are different funding streams. The funding for observation not only come from research funders, it comes from environmental agencies, and it should also come from industry, from private activities. And one example is, thinking about the ocean, what we in Norway call the sustainable ocean economy. You cannot have any sustainable, environmental friendly ocean economy without basic observations of the state of that ocean. So that is always something. The contribution from industries should be much stronger. Of course, one need to follow those essential variables that is defined by, for example, GOOS and GCOS. The operational ability of observations should connect to the Earth observing part. It's very obviously in the future much stronger. And the S3 roadmap, one should think if there could be an Arctic S3 project, research infrastructure. Otherwise, I think I already mentioned how we should address the IPY 2022-23 in the following years, also with strengthening the cooperation among funders, also using the Arctic Science Funders Forum and things like that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you, everyone, to all the speakers.